Welcome to this first session of Unit 503 on communication. I don't think I need to really highlight how important communication is to a manager. I think we've done that so far in what we've already talked about, and I think we're going to focus on some key areas. That's interpersonal skills and the different forms and techniques we can use for communication. So you've watched a couple of videos. Let's just go through what was in there. So in that first video where we speak to make people listen, they highlighted 7 deadly sins. Hopefully we'll be looking to avoid those. And then they talked about some foundations. It was more about relationships where we talked about it originally and where we used that video. And then he moved on to finally talking about our toolbox, our voices, and claims that we don't use them fully. We don't play our instruments as well as we could do. And then we moved on to friends, talking about the highlighting of how important non-verbal communication is. And I know they're over exaggerating it because it's a comedy, but they focused on a really important point. They said that over 90% of our communication is non-verbal. Okay, so that's talking about non-verbal communication as identified in Mehrabian's rule, the Armenian psychologist who came up with a theory about speech, which suggests that 7% of what we communicate is the words we use, 38% is the tone, the pitch of our voice, and 55% of it is body language, the way we talk, the way we act and the way we look when we're talking. So if we put those two together, that's 93% of our communication comes from gestures, body language, position of our shoulders, our hands, our feet, our arms, our facial expressions, frowns and grimaces, verbal cues. And as the man said in the Speak to Make People Listen video, from the pitch and tone, he went on more to say about the register, the timbre, the prosody, the volume, and of course he said silence can speak a lot as well. So with only 7% of our words being what we're communicating, we really need to concentrate on how we communicate and how we use our interpersonal skills. Also the ways we choose to communicate and the techniques we use. For example, say, taking on board what we've just talked about, in an email we're losing 93% of our communication, that non-verbal communication. And yes, therefore, face-to-face communication is probably the best, but inevitably with business pressures and remote working, with different geographical locations nowadays, we spend more and more time communicating remotely, using technology such as mobile phones and the internet, and these sort of things are often referred to as multimodal talking. More on that later. But it is important that we recognise how digital technology has changed the way we communicate and has done forever, and we make appropriate choices. So let's have a look at the areas we're going to look at in this unit. So aims for this session are to understand interpersonal skills and to understand different forms and techniques of communication and how to apply them appropriately in communication. By the end of the session, you should be able to evaluate how interpersonal skills contribute to effective working, analyse how different forms of communication can help or hinder the communication process, and describe a range of communication techniques and when to apply them. So, interpersonal skills. What are they and why are they so important? They're the skills that we need as human beings to interact with others. Most jobs and roles need them because they help us maintain those relationships we've been talking about, and ultimately they impact on how effective we're then going to be at our job. This is particularly true as leaders and managers, where we need to engage, motivate, negotiate, influence, and maintain those relationships. Just a few things we've got to do. And as we've already alluded to in previous units, these skills, some examples coming up on the screen now, are endless. The list is endless. This is just an example of a few. And if we start using those and looking at them individually as roles, we can start to highlight ones that are specific to roles. So, for example, these might be for a team leader. But the list of interpersonal skills, the A to Z list is massive, and there's loads of things in there, and none of them are more important than others. It's just about finding out which ones are the most beneficial or important in a certain role. So in defining these interpersonal skills, if we're going to be looking at them role by role, there might already be some things within our organisation that are embedded that we can use as detail, and if not, we may need to develop. First, there'll be job specifications, and they might have detail that we can use. There might be a list of competencies, those needed across the organisation, or we might have some behavioural frameworks or competency frameworks which start identifying a range of characteristics or personal skills that we can use to differentiate between ineffective and effective performance. If we're linking them to job role so that post holders know what they need to demonstrate, what attitudes, what behaviours they need to show specifically. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail. There might be values, we've already spoken about these, where they're organisational wide and they've been included. These may be linked into appraisals and one-to-ones. And then there's training and qualifications, any assessments that take place. For example, if there's customer service based qualifications that need doing or training, that might include behaviours and the way we should go about acting while we're doing our job. So most of those are self-explanatory, but we'll just have a quick look at a bit more detail at behavioural sort of competencies and frameworks. So before we move on, I'd just like to quickly focus on the sort of frameworks, behavioural frameworks, competency frameworks I've just been talking about. They're quite common in larger institutions, forces, prison service, police, local government, etc. And they may be embedded within your organisation already. They're a way of identifying and explaining sort of a range of individual characteristics or personal skills that you expect to see, so that you can measure the differentiation between how they're used when performance is effective and when it's ineffective. So they're linked to job role, and the post holder will know what's expected of them and how they should demonstrate the skills that's required for that specific role. It's just a way of giving transparency and guidance to both sides, a way of manager on judging what the person is doing and if they're doing enough or if they're doing it to the level expected. But it also lets the employee know, or the team know, what they should be doing and what they should be striving for. And just to confirm that, here's an example from Scottish Prison Service about face-to-face communication, quite a common one. You can see it gives a scale going up that you can use to judge performance. It gets the levels go higher in complexity, and one role might be expected to achieve level 2, clarify and emphasize messages. That might be a receptionist, just for example, and level 4 might be expected of the admin manager. So we're just looking, it's just an example, and it just clarifies that. So if they're in place within your organization, these can be really useful. So whether those things are in place in your organisation or not, we need to be looking and reviewing. So if it's already in place, we need to review it. And if not in place, we need to start thinking about it, because we should be looking at what interpersonal skills are needed dependent on the role. So the steps we should take on that is review the role. Look at the job description. Is it clear what's required of them? Does it match up with their function? And what would make it effective, and what do they have to do to be effective at it, not just a list of things. And then we need to map their interactions, and this is where we start bringing our relationship stuff. We need to be looking at what the stakeholders are to them achieving their role and making it effective, and what are their main forms of communication, because depending on what the main forms of communication are, it may change the interpersonal skills that are needed. And from that we can look at using it to think, are there any improvements, and how could we sort of move up that level of complexity if needed? What would make them more effective? And then we can use that for development and training purposes. So we need to be thinking about this with the teams we're working with the individuals we're working with, and seeing how we can improve communication throughout the process and throughout the organisation by allowing us to look at individual skills, role skills, looking at where it could be improved and how we could make developments. So, quick activity now focused around interpersonal skills. First thing I want you to do is there's a link in the course which gives you a link to an online interpersonal skills assessment, so you can just do a self-assessment of your own interpersonal skills, and then complete a worksheet which has got 2 parts based around your role. It's about picking out what you believe are the essential interpersonal skills for your role, and then evaluating why you think they're important, why they make you so effective or make the person in your job effective. So the first bit is around your own personal skills assessment. The second bit is around what you think is important for your role, and then you might be able to marry up the two and see where you fit in. But do those two, so do your skills assessment and do your worksheet and upload them both, and then I'll see you on the next part.